Hi, I am Mark Malkoff, and welcome to Inside Late Night, presented by LateNighter.com. Today's guest is Susan Morrison, the author of the best-selling book Lorne, about the creator of Saturday Night Live, Lorne Michaels. We discuss Susan Morrison's writing of the book, her chats with Michaels, attending SNL the first season as an audience member, and much more. Now, it's time to go inside Late Night. Susan Morrison, thanks for talking with us.
Happy to be here.
I'm so fascinated by your book, Lorne, New York Times bestseller. I mean, if you're a comedy person or just, it transcends ages to me. For somebody that's, this show's 50 years, you have people that are obsessed with it from, Zers up until boomers. And it's just one of those things where as a TV person, I couldn't believe how good it was. I wanted it to be good. And I talked to Bill Carter, actually, who got an advance copy. And I'm like, please tell me. Because I know your reputation, but you've never done a book. I'm like, please tell me that this book is what I want it to be. And he's like, Mark, it exceeds. It is that good. And it was. So congratulations.
Thank you so much. When I heard from Bill Carter, who I've read my whole life, that it not only passed muster, but that he was enlightened by it and found out cool things, I was so thrilled. I mean, he's my ideal reader, and what a lovely, brilliant man. So that was just great.
That is what Bill and I wanted, and I think a lot of the public, that's exactly what you were writing about. I mean, I consider myself, I know a lot about SNL. There's people that have been on the show for years that say, more than we do and stuff. And just to kind of read in the access and just the openness of Lorne was fascinating. Like, we're going to what were you going to say?
Well, I was going to say that, I've been watching the show since the first season. And I worked briefly for Lorne in 1984, very briefly. But I have a lot of friends who've always worked at the show. So around the time of the 40th, I just realized, no one has been more responsible for what Americans think is funny, what makes people laugh for generations and generations, for 40 years. And I also knew that Lorne was very private. He rarely talked to the press. I mean, he would dutifully give those interviews to Bill Carter when there was an important news thing happening, but he was kind of hiding in plain sight, and I was lucky that I approached him when I did, when I think he was starting to think about his legacy, and he was surprisingly extremely open, and we got into a great groove talking about all of it.
This was 50 times more or less on Fridays. You would go over to the show on production weeks and sit down. You get a whole week shadowing with him, which he said no to Aaron Sorkin. When Sorkin trying to do kind of a competing show. There were different tones. But the thing that I wanted to ask you is, you're well known. Comedians adore your work. New Yorker. You'd never written a book. So you write a book proposal, did Miss Morrison write a book proposal? So you write a proposal, and it gets to all the publishers, and you make it a completely disclosure. I do not have the approval of Lorne Michaels that he said that he's going to talk to me for this. You put it all out. Bidding war all over the place. During this process, were you nervous at all? Were you apprehensive that it was going to get leaked to Lorne Michaels? Because I get the feeling from talking to powerful people off camera, off the record, that they are afraid of him. And even publishers, were you nervous that this was going to get leaked to Lorne, that you were working on this before you went to him? Kind of like a Gene Domanian didn't go to him directly.
Well, that's interesting. I mean, this wasn't me, sort of double crossing him in any way. But of course, I know how powerful he is, and he has friends in high places all over the place. So it did occur to me that he might, my book proposal might have fallen into his hands. But, there's nothing to be ashamed of, nothing in the book proposal that would have been, frightening or scary. Although I guess I did make it completely clear in the book proposal that it wasn't going to be a hagiography. I had been hearing all of my writer friends kind of bitch and moan about Lorne for 30 years. So I knew that there were controversial aspects to how he ran the show and how he managed people. And it's one of the things that I hope to delve into, was that management technique sometimes withholding, sometimes cruel? Was that intuitive, or was it something he learned by reading books about management? How did it all come to be? So I guess it's possible that if he had gotten his hands on the proposal, it might have upset him. But I don't know that he did. It circulated for about a week. I signed the deal with Random House, and then I went to see Lorne in his office, and He was very friendly. But when I said, I said, Lorne, I just signed a deal to write a book about you and the show, and I don't need anything from you. But if you would like to talk with me, I think it'll be a better, richer book and reflect your legacy better. And, anyone who's read the book learns that Lorne hates surprises and he likes to have his hand on the wheel. He likes to be in control. So when I first said that, I think he looked like he was going to keel over. He was genuinely surprised. I don't think news of the proposal had reached him. And, maybe for like a minute, he kind of tried to talk me out of it, but then he just played it cool in his usual way and said, well, let's talk about it again. And, I think he was trying to use the thing that I describe in the book as the Fabian strategy, which is a thing that comes up in 30 Rock, where the Alec Baldwin character, drawing on his high school Latin lessons about the Emperor Fabius Maximus, just wins every war by attrition, by never actually going to battle. Lorne is good at kicking everything down the road. So I thought, well, that's what he's doing. He's just going to kind of play me along here. But 3 days later, we met for a drink. And to my astonishment, he just started right in telling stories. There were no preliminaries, no negotiations. He asked nothing of me. He didn't want to see anything. He didn't want any control. He put no conditions on it. And I was sitting there in this bar while he was, telling me stories about Flip Wilson and Robert Goulet. I was like, I didn't even have a pad, so I was running into the ladies' room, scrawling things on the back of a phone bill. But then we were just off. And I think that he agreed. Partly, the timing was right. He just was thinking about his legacy. He liked and respected me. He loves the New Yorker. And I think he figured, well, if someone's going to inflict a book on him, better it be Susan Morrison from the New Yorker than some, entertainment hack schlemiel who would turn something sensational around in a year or so. I think he knew that I was going to take it seriously.
I always go back to these people with incredible careers in the entertainment industry and probably any industry. Someone like Lorne Michaels, like a gazillion Emmys, the accolade everywhere he goes, people in awe of him. And instead of focusing on all those accomplishments, still not over the Chris Smith New York magazine article. It's going to be 30 years. I think it's 30 years close to this. And for somebody, I think that was the last time that they might have let an outsider in for 30 years. So if it was somebody else, I don't know if something like this would have worked. I've always wondered what his private thoughts were on Chris Smith. Like he's done interviews saying that he remembers the name Chris Smith. He'll never get it out of his head and stuff. But I've never heard him just so honest about his true feelings about that whole thing. And I talked to Chris Smith about it briefly. I met him once, and his whole thing was, this is what I saw, this is what I observed, which I think definitely is part true, but there was stuff that was in there that I feel like was unfair in my personal opinion. What did you get talking to Lorne about that Chris Smith piece? And
that was very interesting because, Lorne was open with me and in general, but I didn't see him, he doesn't often... Well, it's not as if he lost his composure, but he doesn't crack that often and sort of show you some kind of visceral feelings. And when we talked about the Chris Smith article, I could see that he was still hurt and seething about it. And I think he also felt, Chris Farley, he was pictured on the cover of that issue of New York Magazine with his head crammed into a little TV set. And the cover line was, "Comedy isn't funny." And, the story made Chris Farley cry. I mean, for years, he worried that he had ruined the show because of it. So I think for Lorne, it wasn't even as much just a feeling of personal betrayal. I let this guy in, but he knew that it had discombobulated and disconcerted his whole staff. It threw everything off. But the other reason, so that's the emotional reason, but the practical reason that I think that story, which was this big takedown of SNL in the mid-90s that appeared in New York Magazine, and which the writer compared the show to like late period Elvis, really bloated and dysfunctional. But is that it was right around that time that Lorne encountered an obstacle that he had never encountered before, which is that the critics and the network were on the same side. They both were really down on SNL. Now, Lorne had weathered many, bad negative articles about the show with the headline "Saturday Night Dead," and he had weathered a little bit of network interference. But generally, he didn't have those two on the same side against him. So here he was the odd man out. You had the press led by Chris Smith saying that the show was a disaster. And the network executives were kind of bolstered by the success of Friends and Seinfeld. And they thought, this isn't working. We're going to get under the hood and try to make it work. And it was the article that, without the Chris Smith article, I don't think you'd have had things happening like Don Ohlmeyer and the other NBC West Coast people interviewing young Judd Apatow, and suggesting that he could take over the show. It was the first time where Lorne really felt mortal. He felt like NBC could fire him. So that was a big change.
The Chris Smith article, going back, and I haven't read it in a while, but there were definitely things like Sarah Jessica Parker hosted, and she was talking about how Lorne, I think she had some, I don't know, was talking about the week, or maybe had some issues with some sketches or anything, and Lorne put his head on the desk, and it was kind of dismissive. But it didn't include that I know of, that Lorne, his wife, had just given birth that week, or was about to give birth, or did, and there was complications with the pregnancy possibly and stuff, and there was no context.
It was also the same day that Michael O'Donoghue died. I mean, it was a killer week.
They didn't put that in either, I don't think. I mean, he did write that Bill Murray came and did the, but there was definitely more context with some of the stuff that I don't feel. But I talked to producers, I talked to people that were over there at the time when this went down, and just the anger of people feeling betrayed. And just for 30 years, for that still being an issue, I thought was so interesting.
Well, let me just jump in. One of the things that's interesting is that a lot of the writers and performers from that cast, I remember talking to a lot of those people. I watched the SNL 50th show. It was really fun, in a hotel room with a lot of the writers, including Dave Mandel, who was there at the time. And those guys definitely feel that they were, that it wasn't really fair. That it was sort of a hit job, and things were taken out of context, and they were all made to look like losers. And the irony is that even though the show was a real hit job, it succeeded in bringing the cast and the crew and Lorne closer together. They felt bonded in their, they felt that they had been under attack, and, small comfort, but they all did, all those people. It's not just Lorne. They all feel that piece was beyond the pale.
Smigel told me he tried to make it clear to Chris Smith, this is it's sports. It's they had lost Dana Carvey, they lost Robert Smigel, they lost Jack Handy, the Turners, some of the most valuable people, and it was going to be rebuilding, and that really wasn't conveyed. Do you think if Lorne didn't have pressure from the networks with Don Ohlmeyer and Gary Constantine, that the changes would have been made, that they would have, I don't know, I think Sandler and Farley might have been back. I don't know if they would have gone to the Groundlings with Farrell and O'Terry, because he hadn't hired a Groundlings cast member since Julius Sweeney, and they were not really pro Groundlings for a long time. Do you think that it would have been inevitable that Lorne would have made those changes?
Gee, that's such an interesting question. Well, what Lorne always says, that it takes 3 years, to really affect a cast turnaround. Even if you hire a whole bunch of people, they're not going to take, in the first year. It takes a while. So I think that he would have kept Farley and Spade, Farley and Sandler. I think he would have kept those guys, but I think he would have found his way to Farrell and the Groundlings. I think that would have happened. It just might have happened in a slower fashion. I think he has a pretty good sense of the rhythms for how to replenish. The only time when I think his instinct was sort of behind the curve that way was in how long it took him, to sort of really get that he did need to take some extraordinary measures in order to achieve the kind of racial diversity that the show should have. He dragged his feet on that for a long time.
To me personally, it seemed like the culture had to change, and it was like that in entertainment before the show reached up to the diversity. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that what Lorne always said, and I think he was entirely sincere, and, we have the same thing here at the New Yorker. I mean, that this is the place is based on excellence. It's very simple. Just hire his take was hire the funniest people you could find, whoever they are, whatever they look like, and then it's going to work out. And, that sort of worked until it didn't work, until society had changed in such a way that you really did, it was accepted. I mean, now that's swinging back with all the anti-DEI nonsense going on from Washington. But there was really a collective sense that you needed to exert some extra effort to make the show, or any institution more reflective of the population of the United States. And I think that for Lorne, one of the things that, there's a lot of pressure on him from the press. But I think also it kind of jibed with something he says all the time, which is the show's on in all 50 states. The show's for all Americans. And I think he must have also realized, well, wait a minute, my cast doesn't reflect the demographics of America now. And then he started, he had that special audition where he saw 25 African-American women in the middle of a season because he wanted to change things. And, and he's continued in that direction now. The staff is especially diverse and the writing staff is more diverse.
It has. It's just amazing to think back that 95, 96 when Will Ferrell came in, that they did a press conference and they had no black cast members and Tim Meadows had been let go, moves all his belongings back to Chicago.
Yeah.
And then they call him back with 2 weeks and they're like, would you like to come back and stuff? And it's just in a completely different place. What stands out is a 16-year-old Susan Morrison going over to 30 Rock to see the first season and see Elliot Gould host the show. Because the first time I saw the show, I was 16. I could tell you everything from the warm-up to what got cut at dress. I know this was going on a long time, but can you just take me through what you do remember leading up? You're going up the elevators and what stands out?
Well, first of all, I don't know. I was from the suburbs. I don't know if I had ever even been in Rockefeller Center. So walking in that building is, first of all, this kapow. It's so glamorous. And it's funny. It's one of the things that Lorne recognized in 1975, the first time he visited that studio. He said, well, first of all, audiences, are just going to be put in a good mood just by walking in this building. It's different from going to one of those like CBS sound stages on West 57th Street, which, might as well be like just a basement. But so I remember it being very glamorous, but the thing that I was not prepared for is that we didn't have the word meta in 1975, but that kind of breaking the fourth wall, that the fact that I was sitting in the middle of a working television studio. Our seats were right next to home base, right next to it used to be like a little walkway that stuck out into the audience that season. And so just looking up at Leon Redbone in the chair and Elliot Gould, I had no idea that there were going to be cameras flying around my head, the cue card people right next to me. You'd see costume changes happening in a corner, the scenery trundling in and out. That was, to me, the most extraordinary thing. I just, that I was sort of getting to see how the sausage was made. And the comedy, the thing I remember most, that had the brilliant Star Trek sketch where Belushi plays Captain Kirk. And oh my God, it was so funny. And Elliot Gould comes on as an NBC executive canceling the show, canceling Star Trek. And he plucks the Spock ears off of Chevy Chase. And even that, the idea that a show would be making fun of NBC in an NBC studio, that kind of blew my mind. I was back in Connecticut, probably reading, Jane Austen in my English class or something. I mean, I was not that sophisticated about showbiz. And I could tell that what was happening here was really, just structurally groundbreaking. I think a lot of the comedy references, I bet if I watched that Weekend Update, I probably wouldn't have gotten a lot of it. I don't know if I was getting the Generalissimo Franco stuff at that point.
That was the amazing thing about that show, is they play up to the top of their intelligence, where as 16-year-old, I was watching the show, there were definitely things I wasn't necessarily getting.
I think this is in Al Franken's book, but Jim Downey, longtime head writer of the show, and Al Franken always said, and I think this is really true, and it's a hard thing to pull off, that in terms of like the political references, the news references in the show, they always wrote it so that it could reward people who were incredibly au courant and got the references, but it wouldn't penalize you if you didn't. The jokes work on a pure comedy level. And, if you get the Tom DeLay thing and everything, lucky you, but you're not going to not get it if you don't have all those insider shadings of knowledge.
It seemed like you got almost everybody to talk. The only people I saw, and It's one of those things where it's hard. I don't know personally if they turned you down, you weren't able to get a hold of them, or possibly, I know from my own interviewing people over the years, hundreds of people, that sometimes people privately are not doing well.
Uh-huh.
But I know the two people I noticed that weren't there, and I want to know if there's anybody else, and if you approach these people, were Edie Baskin and Jim Singarelli.
I saw Jim. I knew Jim from before because we worked together at the news show. I saw Jim at one of Franken's Senate fundraisers at the Turner's apartment and told him I was doing this. And we kept trying to plan it. And he was just kind of all over the place. And then he was having some health problems. So it was just basically after 5 years of reporting, I kind of said, oh, I have to stop and I have to start writing. And if I could backfill, I will. Edie Baskin, I got back in touch with when I was doing photo research. She was another person who, it's not for that she didn't want to talk to me. It's just more that I kind of ran out of time. And then I had some nice conversations with her toward the end when she was, I was licensing some photos from her. Now there's one person that I didn't get to talk to that I would have liked to, but again, at a certain point, since I had everybody, I had to kind of just stop. And this is just sort of a funny story because the only person who actually I got kind of a turn down from, and I don't even know if he was ever given the ask, was Andy Samberg. I thought I would have liked to talk to him just about the digital shorts and everything. And this is, I think the reason that didn't happen was because he was probably the only person that I approached through a publicist. I mean, pretty much everybody else, it was just word of mouth. This person would put me onto that person because I knew a lot of these people already. But I was dealing with Andy Samberg's publicist for some other New Yorker piece that I was working on. And I knew she represented him. So I said, oh, by the way, I'm doing this book. I've talked to everybody. I would love, to get on the phone with Andy or take him for coffee. And she said like, oh, okay. And just basically never delivered him, which it was irritating to me.
I'm so surprised. I think that it probably didn't get to him. I've been in that situation many times.
Well, yeah, I suspect that this publicist was just, thinking about what the current projects on her docket were, and she wasn't getting any commission off of him talking to me for some book. So I just assumed that he never got the ask. But I think it's kind of hilarious that, the only person that I used a publicist with, he should fire his publicist is all I could say.
I was going to ask you, Jim Singarelli is somebody that lasted for decades until really the digital shorts started to take off commercial parodies. I mean, legendary pieces. Him and Lorne at one point for many years, I'm being polite here, didn't see eye to eye. We're not on the same page in terms of socializing. And it's just the fact that Lorne would keep certain people like Bob Odenkirk, who interviewed you. And Odenkirk told me, quote, we hated each other. This was a couple decades ago. And that he would keep some people on the show that apparently he wasn't fond of personally. Were there people around there that Lorne would keep around other than those? And that was just, as long as they're doing their job, I don't have to like them, but they're good at their job, they can stay?
Well, I think Odenkirk didn't make any, he wasn't that politic a person. He made no attempt to disguise his, sort of contempt.
It was his own fault. He admits it. It was his own fault, 100%.
And today he just says, God, I was such a dick. I mean, tonight I'm going to the opening night of Glenn Ross, which I'm excited that he said, which I'm excited about. But no, he I think was a malcontent, and he recognizes that he was immature. But I think that Lorne, I never spoke to him specifically about this, but I think he always felt that a certain amount of tumult and, that this was just not bad for the mix, just kind of keep people on their toes. I think it's a different thing with someone like Signorelli because, as I say in the book, Lorne likes rabbit's feet. He likes people who are familiar to him, who've been around for a long time. When he hired Howard Shore to be the first musical director of the show, he was his friend from camp in Canada. And I remember Lorne telling me that Michael O'Donoghue said to him at that point, you're hiring a guy from your summer camp in Canada? Are you kidding me? There got to be better people in New York City. But Lorne always gravitated toward, of course, Howard is brilliant and was a brilliant hire. But Lorne liked people who were there at the beginning. There's a comfort level to having these people around. And sure, he and Downey, had bad patches. He and Kevin Nealon had rough patches.
Chevy?
Yeah, definitely. Chevy, Franken and Davis. But if they were part of the family, he would keep them. I always thought it was very interesting how even after some of these staff people, I'm thinking about like John Head, Gary Weiss, people who, were his sort of showed him the ropes, not just about television, but about like what was cool, which is really important to him. People who showed him those ropes early, when he was even before SNL, took care of those people their whole lives. I mean, I don't know if he was sending them an allowance or what, but really always made sure these people had a roof over their head. It's an amazing old fashioned paternalistic sort of setup. It more than once I said it reminded me of The Godfather.
In terms of Johnny Carson, Joan Rivers debacle, 1986, where Carson doesn't find out until I guess the night before that Joan Rivers is going to be going to Fox and signed up to go against him, is the only person that he was kind of, I don't know, Carson and Rivers weren't friends, but they were fond of each other. They had this history. In terms of Gene Domanian, that it's the closest I can think of with Lorne, with somebody that was in-house, that when Lorne found out that Domanian was advised not to say anything when she was negotiating to take over the show. In terms of relationships with somebody internal, is that the closest, do you think, to what Joan Rivers, Johnny Carson? Was there anybody else on that list I'm leaving out?
Let me think. I mean, we know Lorne doesn't like surprises. I mean, I date that part of his personality to his father's death when he was 14 years old. He had an argument with his father one night. Later that night, his father collapsed with a heart issue, was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Lorne didn't get to see him ever again. Then he died, and poor adolescent Lorne carried around this idea with him his whole life that fighting with people is dangerous.
Non-confrontational. It always comes back to that, non-confrontational.
And being surprised is the worst thing that can happen to you. So I think that with Jean, the fact that she was negotiating behind his back, I think that was really painful. And so many other people, when Jim Downey and Gamelin Pross, two writers from the early seasons, went to go to Letterman, and they all described these very formal, almost courtly meetings with Lorne, where they would meet with him and sort of get his blessing. They understood, he's sort of like the character in The Godfather, that Robert Duvall describes as he insists on hearing bad news immediately. I mean, he doesn't want to hear it through the grapevine. And I think that most people, people there become Lorneologists, people find out, they know these things and they spread the word. So I think it's a lot of people had very elaborate stories about how they were telling Lorne that they were moving on. They kind of choreograph it. I mean, Dana Carvey told me that he was so scared of telling Lorne that he was going to leave. He just couldn't do it. He kind of ran away from home in the middle of the night,
Yeah, it was mid-season without any really fanfare or press.
But Lorne loved him, and I think he understood him. And I don't think there were any hard feelings there.
Keep bringing him back. I was surprised that Lorne thought that NBC would ask him back in 1980, only because Fred Silverman, I think Fred was still there at the network at the time. Just because of that, if there wasn't a Fred Silverman, who I believe had some issues with Lorne, maybe stemming from Al Franken and some of the treatment on the show, was that pretty much, do you know, or do you think was the stumbling block for them not asking Lorne to come back, other than he was burned out? He said he was burned out.
Yeah, I don't think that. I think it's actually a very pragmatic business thing. And I think Lorne this is how he would see it. He asked for 6 months off so he could rest, hire a whole new cast, hit reset. And Silverman said, and I bet this is true, we've already sold the ad slots in the fall. You can't come on in January. We've sold the ads. And NBC was in dire straits right then. It was sort of tanking. It would just not have made a business sense for Silverman to have to go back to these advertisers and say, whoops, the show's actually not coming on until January. I think, he was that kind of hard-nosed business guy. So he said to Lorne, sorry, got to start on time. And I did think that Lorne thought that maybe they would be able to negotiate their way around it. What happened then was that as the next round of negotiations was about to start, Franken did that Weekend Update thing where he just made fun of Silverman having a limo and,
limo for the limo, or
limo for a lamo was this. He asked people to send postcards, against saying that, Fred Silverman was a lamo. And I don't think I don't think that that was the thing that caused it to go, that was why Lorne didn't come back to the show. But I think that the tensions were so evident, after, the whole business thing of ads being sold, that this was just rubbing salt into the wound. And I think that at that point, Silverman just said, forget it, let's just forget it.
I want to ask you, Steve Higgins has been at that show since 1995 as Lorne's number 2 person creatively. Other than giving him his feedback on sketches after read through, he's witty at host dinners, I hear, and a very funny man. What does he do? Because, Jim Downey had that kind of number 2, and he was very hands-on with writing, and he was writing sketches. And I know Steve Higgins was early on. I just don't hear that from people that is his role. What does he do? And by the way, I just want to point out that I heard he's one of the funniest people ever. And it seems to me when he's on Fallon, he's holding back probably his wit somewhat. And I can understand that. But what does he do? You observed.
Well, I'm going to answer those questions out of order. I mean, first of all, he's really funny in the room. He just, in meetings when things are really tense, he's always the guy who just has I remember at the meeting between Dress and Air, the week I was there for the Jonah Hill show, there was this discussion of this piece, Teacher Fell Down by Allison Gates. It was a Kate McKinnon sketch, very moody piece. And somebody said, something like, yeah, the character has a touch of Betty Davis in her. And Higgins just came back and he said, yeah, if you want to get the tweens, now Voyager, it's just so funny. Yeah. But no, he's very silly in a meeting, and Lorne likes silly. And, he does like that strand of silly, hard laugh. But in terms of his professional duties at the show, I think a word I use somewhere in the book is he's a reliable errand man. We were talking a minute ago about how Lorne avoids confrontation. Higgins is very often the guy who tells people that they're hired and who tells people that they're fired. He'll go and sit down with somebody and tell them how it's going or how it's not going. And he is that guy. A lot of the producers have that function. Aaron Doyle, Eric Kenward, they do versions of this. But I think that Higgins, because he's been there so long, he has a little bit of a sage status. I remember him saying to me, Lorne wrote the Constitution to SNL. But Higgins is also, he's kind of an interpreter of that Constitution. He'll go around and explain people how things work and what they should do, and way more than Jim Downey ever did, because Jim Downey, was a brilliant writer and an encourager of creativity. But I don't really think that, he was that effective or nimble an administrator. And Higgins, surprisingly, is good at that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, everybody I talked to in terms of his being really, really funny and just having him around as a constant source of just really, really stable and really great for an overall environment, for sure. How would you describe Lorne Michaels and Dick Ebersol's actual relationship? Their real relationship. It seems to me, and I could be off, that Lorne, if he could get an erase button, it seems like a lot of the Ebersol stuff wouldn't exist. I could be off on that. That's just for me. But in terms of their actual real relationship, because I like Jason Reitman, I don't think you probably, in that movie, probably was a good reflection of their actual, that's at least the gist I get from talking to people of their relationship. But how would you describe their relationship?
Well, if I had to choose one word for it, it was transactional. When they first met before SNL, I think that they both were genuinely, I think they did have a little mind meld, and they were both very young people in Hollywood who had a vision. Both of them thought that the variety show format needed to be updated. Other variety shows were almost like vaudeville. They were like the 50s. And Lorne told Ebersol, look, there's no reason why TV can't be like the movies, which, you had Altman and Scorsese and Malick breaking boundaries with the movies, and rock and roll, which was, pushing the music industry forward. But TV was kind of a backwater. And Ebersol was the first executive who he met. He was preternaturally young as an executive who saw it that way. I mean, Lorne had been talking to executives for years, and when he talked to them about what he wanted to do, they would just stare at him. They didn't get it at all. Monty Python wasn't on in the States yet. They had no idea what he was talking about. But Ebersol was the first person who sort of was on his wavelength in terms of content. And he also worked at the network. so he could be, a go-between between these old fogey executives and Lorne. So, Lorne just basically saw him as kind of an on-ramp. And I think that they must have had, some simpatico. I mean, they must have been, I don't know that they were ever friends. Ebersol was kind of a nerd. He tried too hard. Lorne's whole thing was to be very laid back and soigné. And when Ebersol would come around his Lorne's suite at the Chateau Marmont, he kind of stuck out like a rube who was trying too hard in his kind of ultra preppy clothes. Lorne's friends were kind of sitting around smoking pot, talking in their English accents. But the fact is that Ebersol did get the show on the air, and Lorne was grateful. And I think he admired his facility with the higher ups. Now, what Lorne gave to Ebersol was kind of cool, some kind of cool cachet. And then once the show was off and running, it was a very standard issue kind of, breakdown of Ebersol wanted more credit for the creative part of the show than Lorne thought was appropriate. He started, talking about the show to reporters without even mentioning Lorne's name. And I think Lorne felt that he started neglecting his, network duties. He was the guy who was supposed to keep things running smoothly behind the scenes, dealing with the budgets, dealing with the higher ups. And suddenly you had Ebersol booking ABBA on the show, which was really anathema to someone like Lorne, who did not want ABBA on his show.
Things change, and then they're booking boy bands and stuff.
Generationally. Well, now it's like a publicity stop, for every big A-list star. But back then, Lorne's whole thing was he wanted people who wouldn't otherwise have ever done network television.
Yeah, it was incredible. Tom Waits, the people that they were putting on TV. Severance is one of my favorite TV shows, and your daughter, Nancy and Helen, worked on the show. Were you tempted to ask for spoilers? Did you get any spoilers?
I didn't get spoilers. I did watch this whole second season with Nancy, which was really fun. And I would be asking her, so what happened then? What were the goats like? And she had all kinds of backstage tidbits. But I think from the way they shot it, it's not as if they shot it consecutively. And she, and I get the impression from her, Adam Scott, who she works for, and it was like, they weren't really sure how it was all adding up either. So everybody, it sounds like, was completely thrilled that this season was as big a hit as it was. I mean, I think it's brilliant.
I loved every second of
it. I loved it.
I couldn't believe that. I mean, just the pressure to keep that the quality up. Did you know in advance, last question, that you were going to be on Jeopardy, had question on Jeopardy?
Oh my God, no, that was the most exciting part of the whole thing.
I mean, that must have been so surreal, because I know they tape it in advance, but, I didn't know how they locked that stuff down where you were maybe tipped if you watch this night.
No, so a friend just texted me a picture from a taxi. And then I happened to be riding in a taxi from JFK, and it came on, and I just felt like it was like the Twilight Zone.
I feel like I could talk to you forever. Would you come back at some point?
Sure. No, let's do it again at the end of the season or the paperback, or I'm happy to.
I would absolutely love for you to come back. New York Times bestseller, Lorne, highly recommend it. For somebody that knows too much about SNL, I was blown away by it. So congratulations. And I know that your original manuscript, the one that Judd Apatow calls the director's cut, was like over 1,000 pages. And I'm just saying, for the paperback, I would gladly pay $50, $100 for that. So I'm just putting that in your ear.
Well, one thing that might be fun to do in the paperback is a glossary of all the SNL terminology that a lot of people keep telling me that they like that. So maybe I should think about that.
Oh, I hope you do. Thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you. Really fun, Mark. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe so you never miss an episode. On Apple Podcasts, please rate it and leave a review. Be sure to go to latenighter.com for all your late night TV news. And you can find my podcast at latenighter.com/podcasts. Have a wonderful week, and I'll see you next Tuesday.